If you want to learn real history, real economics, and real political theory, then check out Liberty Classroom. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Daniel McAdams about the Iran deal and the Trump administration's Iran policy. Mr. McAdams is the Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and co-host of the Liberty Report with former Congressman Ron Paul. He served as the Foreign Affairs, Civil Liberties, and Defense Policy Advisor to Congressman Paul from 2001 to 2012. You can follow his work at ronpaulinstitute.org or on Twitter at Ron Paul Institute or at Daniel L. McAdams. You can find the Liberty Report at ronpaullibertyreport.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iran-policy. Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be with you guys again.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again. So the Iran nuclear deal, the situation as relates to Iran from a U.S. standpoint, it's been in the news a lot, and Trump just within the last handful of days had some major things to say about his administration's Iran policy. So we'll get into that in a second. But I just want to go back to the Iran deal, because that in many ways is at the core of this discussion. So can you give an overview of what the Iran deal is and who the parties to the deal are and what the terms of the deal are?
Sure. Well, I'll do my best. It was the P5+1 talks, and they went on for a good couple of years. The idea was to find a mechanism to prevent Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons in exchange for lifting of international sanctions, and a lot of those sanctions were imposed by the UN, and so that's the reason it had to sort of be a UN deal to undo the sanctions that the U.S. Forced forced in a way the UN to implement against Iran. So the benefit to our side, let's say, it was in Iran that wasn't pursuing nuclear weapons, and the benefit to Iran was to reemerge into the international economic community and to start doing business and to not be isolated financially, economically. So it was a long process, and frankly, I think it was the highlight of an otherwise pretty dismal Obama administration, creating this deal with Iran. And also opening up to Cuba, I think, are the two things that should be remembered as successes in the Obama administration.
Yeah, and after the deal was signed, there was some people who were saying, well, we're not totally sure if this is going to stay put and for how long it was going to stay put after Obama left. And now that Trump's in office, we definitely see folks trying to push against the deal. And the big claim that we're hearing from the anti-deal crowd is that Iran is not complying with the deal. So is there any truth to those claims? Why are folks saying that? And what is there to not comply with?
Well, let's be honest about the people that are saying this. These are the same neoconservatives who lied us into war with Iraq using the same methods, the same techniques, the same obfuscations, the same deceptiveness that they used in Iraq. And frankly, I'm talking about people like John Bolton. Let's be frank about the people and who they are. These people should have a scarlet letter on their forehead for what they've done. But they are the same people. They're making the same arguments, and they're getting the same media coverage. But what they are saying about Iran, and even what President Trump did, they're not able to say objectively that Iran is not in compliance with the agreement, because everyone in the world knows they are. Even the IAEA, even every other signatory says technically they are in compliance. And even the infractions that Trump mentioned in his speech that he played up as being serious infractions, they were nothing of the sort. For example, the heavy water issue, extremely minor. Iran was only allowed to have a certain amount of heavy water, which is water that radioactive water used for non-military purposes. When they got close to that limit, they did what they were supposed to do in accordance with the deal, which is to either sell or otherwise dispose of this water before it went over the limit. So, and that's just one example. We can go over many of them, but there is no way that Iran is technically in violation. So what Trump has done and what the neocons that are pushing him in this direction are saying is that they are in violation of the spirit of the agreement. It gives it kind of a mystical property, doesn't it? There's a spirit of the agreement rather than, no, this is something that's on paper, that's been hammered out. It has specific aspects to it that have been agreed upon, like any contract. And there's no way they cannot find anything that Iran is out of compliance with.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of what the deal has to say about heavy water reactors, but there were a lot of other parts to this deal. There were restrictions on centrifuges, on uranium enrichment, clauses about sanctions relief. Can you get a little more into some of the main points of the deal and what Trump has said about Iran and whether they're violating those points?
Well, there are a lot of technical agreements in the deal, with regard to all of the shutting down the centrifuges, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have the specifics of how many thousands they were required to shut down, but I do know that they had shut them down, and Iran has been certified from when the deal was signed in 2015 until just last Friday by the U.S. presidents. It certainly has been certified by the IAEA and by the European partners in the deal. From the beginning. So all the technical aspects of the deal, which frankly some of it is beyond me, but all the technical aspects of the deal have been certified by the international community, by the United Nations, and even essentially by the U.S. And the interesting thing about the Trump administration, even within his closest advisors, even his closest circles, even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even his defense secretary have said, look, Iran is in compliance. It is going against the U.S. national interest. To claim that they are not, to get out of the deal, is against our interests. And it's not because they've suddenly become doves on Iran, because they're not. But it has to do with the U.S. as a deal maker, the perception of the U.S. and with the North Korea crisis. If the U.S. is seen as not being able to make a deal with the international community, as not an honest broker, is doing things like talking about the spirit of a deal, the spirit of a contract rather than the specifics of it, then you've got a real problem, and I think that's what they're worried about.
And of course, Trump was supposed to be this great deal maker. He played that up on the campaign trail. He even wrote a book, or I guess it was ghost written in his name, called The Art of the Deal, and he kept talking about that nonstop on the campaign trail. But we're not really seeing this deal making. So when he says that Iran is violating the spirit of this agreement, can you get a little more into what exactly he has in mind there and why he would say something like that?
Well, I think, to be fair to Trump, and I've been very, very disappointed with his presidency so far when it comes to foreign policy, the rhetoric of the campaigner versus the actions of the president. But in his realm, in what he has done and how he has had success in his life, he may well be an expert deal negotiator. When it comes to the hard ball politics of New York real estate market, I can only imagine what it's like. He may be a real butt kicker when it comes to doing a deal. But this is different. This is international diplomacy. This is where if you want to get something, you've got to give something. That's the whole point. And so what Trump seems to want with the Iran deal 2 years after it's been in effect, to everyone's advantage, economic advantage, geopolitical advantage, everyone has been advantaged by this deal. But what he wants to do is go back and renegotiate parts of the deal to what he believes is the U.S. advantage without giving anything to the other side. International diplomacy does not work this way. So I think there's a great naivete when it comes to the part of President Trump outside the realm of his expertise, which is in, hard-boiled business dealings, So to give him a little bit of credit, but he also has to know when he is out of his league, and he doesn't seem to understand that.
Now, one thing that we hear a lot too is folks saying, well, maybe we can deal with them, but Iran is a bunch of bad guys. They're up to no good. They're a state sponsor of terror, and that means we should always play hardball with them because they're a threat. What would you say to those folks and people at home who are like, well, I don't really know anything about Iran, and they might be a destabilizing force in the region. So why is that not really a good argument?
I think you can address this on a number of issues. First of all, if Iran is a destabilizing force in the Middle East, as a non-interventionist, I don't see how that affects the United States. The last time I checked, we don't have any borders with the Middle East, and the reason we pay for our defense budget is to protect the United States. So if another country destabilizes another area, I mean, get in line, because that happens all over the world. It's called looking out for your national interest. So even if that is indeed the case, I don't see how it affects us in the slightest. If we didn't have this idea that we were an empire that had to control the world, that didn't follow the Wolfowitz policy of the U.S. being the absolute control of the world, then we wouldn't even be talking about this. But that aside, what is Iran doing in the Middle East? Well, Baghdad, if you remember, before the Iranian militias became involved, when ISIS had its big push in 2014, Baghdad was within probably days of falling to ISIS. Iran sent in militias, the Shia militias within Iraq, got very, very busy very, very quickly and pushed ISIS back. Now, is that or is that not in at least U.S.'s stated interest? Of course it is. What is Iran doing in Syria? It is fighting against ISIS and al-Qaeda, regardless of what Trump said in his speech, which was absolutely false, and everyone knows it. The idea that Iran is allied with al-Qaeda is absurd. Al-Qaeda is a radical Sunni jihadist group that hates Shia with a passion. So what Iran has done in Syria, whether you like Iran or not, what they've done is they fought ISIS and al-Qaeda because it is in their national interest to fight these two terrorist groups that hate Iran above all. So if that's destabilizing to kick ISIS and al-Qaeda out of the region, then I frankly don't know what stabilizing looks like.
Yeah, and we see this all the time where there's this strange, strange decision where, oh, well, we want to fight Iran, but we also want to fight al-Qaeda, so we'll weaken one, and then the other one will get stronger. So, oh no, and then we have to fight the other one. It's like you can never win, right? If you try to fight one, the other one gets stronger, and then you say, oh well, now we got to fight that one. It's just a very strange policy, and it's very hard to understand.
Well, I would say strange. I would say it's an immoral policy, and the U.S. has pursued it a lot. The U.S. certainly pursued it with the Iran-Iraq war. It pushed Saddam Hussein to attack Iran because we thought Iran was getting too strong in the region. This is in the 80s. And so we pushed this war. We provided Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons, with weapons of mass destruction to use on the Iranians, which they did. And then we helped the Iranians fight against the Iraqis when they thought the Iraqis were getting too strong. So this is really an immoral policy. It does not reflect on American values. It certainly is not in our interest because we end up making enemies of both sides, and you have 1 million people killed in that war. So it's a dumb policy, it's an expensive policy, it's an immoral policy, and it's an anti-American policy.
If you want to win debates and be able to better argue free market ideas, check out Liberty Classroom. For a mere 24 cents a day, which is less than $8 a month, you can learn real history, real economics, and real political theory. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more and to become a more effective debater. Now, one of the issues that we hear brought up from time to time when the laundry list of complaints about the Iranian regime comes up is the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So what is the IRGC? What have they been up to, and have they been violating human rights, as is often claimed?
Well, essentially what the Revolutionary Guard is the equivalent of our special forces. And it's not exactly the case, but that is probably as close as you can get. They were formed immediately after the revolution in 1979 to protect the Iranian leadership against those who wanted to kill them. Obviously, in a revolutionary situation, you have a lot of volatility. So they certainly are involved, and they are special forces, and they do act in the region. But the laundry list, as you point out, the laundry list of grievances against them, frankly, if you look a little bit deeper into the details, there's not a lot to back it up. Does that mean we think they're a bunch of Boy Scouts? No, it certainly doesn't. But at the same time, frankly, it's very hard for us to be on the moral high horse when you talk about our activities in the Middle East, when you talk about our invasion of Iraq in 2003 that left probably 1 million Iraqis dead, was based on lies. And contrary to what John Bolton claimed, the Iraqis are not better off than they were under Saddam Hussein. When you look at the U.S. policy toward Libya, which has destroyed the country to this day, it's run by militias. So, if you want to talk about destabilizing, if you want to talk about violating human rights, when you kill a family of civilians with a drone, you are violating their human rights, and we've done that to thousands and thousands of families. You do have to look at the log in your own eye before you talk about the speck in others' eyes, I believe.
Yeah, and occasionally I feel like we hear this, not occasionally, I feel like we hear this all the time, that there's some sort of human rights abuse, or there's some sort of tragedy that has occurred, and we must take some sort of action because of that. And a lot of times the tragedy hasn't occurred, the tragedy is made up. So I think really where non-interventionists have to win the debate is saying, even if there is a tragedy abroad, why shouldn't we intervene in other people's affairs? I think that's the case that we really have to make, because as I said before, sometimes there are tragedies, and if there isn't a tragedy, they'll just make one up. So in all cases, I feel like there's always going to be, at least in the news, a tragedy that is occurring that, requires some sort of moral action on our part.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And, the neocons will frame it. The interventionists will frame it to their advantage that we must act to prevent X, whereas they only give a small sample of the information. And even if we had all of the information, there are two retorts that I would have. Number one, we have no authority, legal or moral, to go in. For example, if everything they said about Syria was right, and it was just simply a bunch of people that said, hey, we're tired of Assad, we want our democracy, we're tired of this country being ruled by a family. Hey, even if that was the case, we have no moral or legal authority to become involved in their struggle. There's just absolutely no international rationale for this to overthrow the government. But second, the fact of the matter is we do not have enough information about incredibly complex societies with so many different factions competing for power. We cannot come in as people who don't speak the language, who don't know the history, who don't know the culture. We can't go in there like a bull in a china shop and say, okay, here's how you guys are going to organize your country from now on. We've done that. We've done it so many times. And the track record, I mean, if we were playing Major League Baseball, we'd be batting 0. We have, the track record is horrible. So even if you like the idea of us helping people out overseas, the fact of the matter is we botch it every time. So maybe we should just back off.
Yeah, and we had Lori Calhoun on the show a while back to talk about humanitarian interventions, and one of the things we discussed with her is that even when there is an actual tragedy, when there are actual atrocities going on, the U.S. sending its military over there, that doesn't really fix anything. That doesn't really improve the situation, and most of the time it just makes things worse.
Well, our military is great at blowing things up and killing people, and that's what they should do. But they're not very good at going over and deciphering very complex situations, as we just discussed, very difficult issues. They're not very good at dealing with the complexities of calling in airstrikes, for example. And we as we've learned from Afghanistan, you often would have rival tribes appealing to the U.S. military to bomb their adversaries. This had nothing to do with the U.S. national interest, but the local tribes understood that they could use U.S. air power to get rid of their rivals. And that is hardly, from a financial perspective, for us having to pay for it, and from a moral perspective and from a geopolitical perspective, it's an absolute loser.
Yeah, so I want to return to discussing the Trump administration officials and what they have had to say about Iran and the Iran deal. Because earlier you did mention that what Donald Trump has said has differed from what some of the other officials in his administration have said. Now, Nikki Haley seems to be like John Bolton 2.0, but Rex Tillerson has taken some different stances. Can you go through some of the people in the Trump administration and what they have had to say about Iran and the Iran deal?
Well, unfortunately, there are no heroes we can point to. I wish there were. I wish there was a faction that was on our side. But we do know this about Nikki Haley. She has no foreign policy experience. She was the governor of South Carolina. She's a dyed-in-the-wool neocon. There's no question about it. Extraordinarily hawkish. Her mentor is John Bolton, who we've seen from several news reports, was seen coming in and out of the White House prior to President Trump's speech about Iran. So we can only assume that he has had some serious influence on the speech. So she is the conduit for the neocons into the administration, and she's very close to all of them. But on the other side, you do have military men like Mattis, who's the Secretary of Defense. You do have Dunford, who's the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And these guys are not doves, but they do understand that if we are going to, and they have different perspectives than we do, but if they understand that if we are going to try to diffuse, for example, the North Korea situation, if we're going to try to make deals with other countries, we can't simply walk into the Iran deal and say, hey, you know what? We're going to cancel this unilaterally. Europe, you better follow us or you'll be in trouble. It just doesn't work that way. They see the damage coming from this kind of approach to foreign policy. And frankly, I don't think that President Trump is sophisticated enough. He's not a dumb man, and he's not a neoconservative. But he simply he stepped into a viper's nest where he doesn't know friend or foe. And trust me, as we've learned from George W. Bush, the neocons are very good at whispering sweet nothings into your ear.
Sure, and I just want to clarify for listeners out there who maybe haven't heard the term neocons as much. Obviously, those of us who are non-interventionists, we throw this term around a lot, but for people that maybe watch mainstream news a little more often, you don't really hear that term come up as much. So can you just give a little brief overview on what the neocons believe and who they are?
Yeah, and it is kind of a shortcut term, and it's you can, it can be overused, and we tend to use it a lot. But these are people who have a vision of the United States as the unrivaled power in the world. So whatever it costs, $1 trillion military budget is not enough. Whatever it costs to put out every little brush fire across the earth, to project U.S. military power in every corner of the globe, because they have this sort of Manichaean view of the world that if the United States is not involved in every single crisis overseas, it will absolutely result in a diminishment of U.S. power, of U.S. Standard of living, of U.S. security. And the non-interventionists would argue that the opposite is the case. If we involve ourselves in every little brush fire across the globe, we expend our economic resources, we expend our diplomatic resources, we make enemies overseas, and in fact, we are weakened and less able to deal with the rest of the world if we view ourselves as the world's policemen. So that's the contrast between the neocons or the interventionists, whatever word you want to use, and us, the non-interventionists.
Yeah, and the neocons also aren't really bothered by innocent civilians being killed halfway across the world by communities and countries that they've never been to just being completely decimated. That doesn't seem to bother them.
Well, their intellectual forefathers are the Trotskyists. The father of someone like Bill Kristol, the father of someone like John Podhoretz. These are all New York Trotskyites. They come from the far left. And, the Trotskyite philosophy, first of all, it's internationalist. It's about having a perpetual revolution. And it's the idea that you've got to break a few eggs if you want to make an omelet. So if you have some poor family in Afghanistan getting wiped out by a drone, well, too bad. There's a greater good at play here. Of course, none of these people, the other thing they have in common, they've not been in the military. They don't like the military. They don't like fighting. They like fighting from behind their desk, from behind very, very well-paid jobs. And if you scratch just slightly below the surface on who provides the funding for their jobs, it's places like Lockheed Martin and the other defense contractors. So it's kind of of an internal loop where they promote war, they're paid by the war machine, et cetera, and on you go.
Yeah, it's terrible, but it's the world we live in. Is there anything, any final thoughts or final remarks on the Iran deal before we close up?
Well, the big question remains, what will our European partners do? They have benefited economically in a very significant way from the deal. Those of us, and I can count both of you gentlemen with me, those of us who believe that relationships based on mutual interest, that the U.S. doing business and trading overseas is the greatest bulwark against war. Those of us who believe that business relationships overseas are good for everyone would be heartbroken to see the Europeans pull out of the deal. And I think the Europeans, if they stay in it, if they continue to be successful doing business with Iran, hopefully they will actually set a good example for Americans, particularly look at American workers. Someone who works for Boeing and says, hey, they had ordered a couple of hundred 777s, and now you're telling us we can't sell these planes to Iran, and so now I'm out of work. That's great. Thanks a lot. So hopefully Americans will see that this neocon foreign policy is hitting us in the bottom line directly and indirectly. And we need a peaceful foreign policy, a strong defense of our country, but certainly not a global empire.
Sure. And a lot of the time we'll hear the phrasing along the lines, if we heard this from George W. Bush, you're either with us or with the terrorists. It seems like whenever we argue against a neocon policy or a neocon proposal, their immediate reaction is to say, well, you're with them. Now, we're obviously not, we're not on the side of the Iranian government. I don't think any of us would ever have any desire to pack up and move to Tehran. No interest in that whatsoever. But we are in favor of commerce and honest friendship and negotiations as opposed to war and useless, disgusting propaganda.
Absolutely. I mean, which of us would want to live with in our neighbor's household? Everyone lives differently. They have a different lifestyle. It's one that I don't endorse. I don't prefer to live under any kind of theocracy. Certainly not one of my choosing. So it doesn't mean we have to move in with them. It just means we have to leave them alone, let them live their own lives. If they are going to have evolutionary change toward a different form of government, it has to come from below rather than imposed from outside. But in the meantime, we can do business with them. We can influence them. We can travel. We can visit with them. We can have exchanges. Let's not forget that Iran has the largest Jewish community in the Middle East outside of Israel. So it may not be a perfect government, but they certainly have a lot more tolerance toward other faiths than our great allies, the Saudi Arabians. So there certainly is something there.
And there's automatically a Jewish member of the Iranian parliament as well. That's something that you don't see in other Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah, and they have elections. So as I say, it doesn't mean we're falling on our knees praising Iran, but it means it's not the monster that the neocons want us to believe.
Sure. Plenty of issues with the Iranian government, plenty of things to oppose there, but opposing the Iranian nuclear deal, that doesn't help anything. The deal only moves us towards peace, towards commerce, towards closer relations and friendships, and away from war. So that's something that should be supported moving forward here. So on that note, Daniel, thank you very much for joining us today. I obviously mentioned in the introduction some places and some ways to follow your work. But once again, can you just go over the best ways to follow your work and any resources or readings that you recommend someone check out if they want to follow up on what we've been discussing today?
Well, we would love to have your listeners subscribe to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. It's our daily the video news summary and analysis. That's on YouTube, youtube.com/Ron Paul Liberty Report. We've got about 110,000 subscribers. We'd love to have 1 million. So please join us there. RonPaulInstitute.org is where we publish our articles on foreign policy and also on civil liberties at home. Ron Paul has a new book out, by the way, The Revolution at 10 Years. You can get your copy on Amazon. If you want a personalized copy, you can go to the Ron Paul Institute website, and there is a hyperlink at the top of the page with instructions on how do you get your personalized copy of Ron Paul's new book.
Okay, great. Well, we'll obviously link to everything that you just mentioned and every resource that we've mentioned over the course of this interview, as well as all of Daniel's previous appearances on our show. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iran-policy, easy enough to remember, and that's going to be the one-stop shop, the place to go for resources and links related to our conversation today. So again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iran-policy. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list so that you can get emails when a new episode is published, so that way you'll be right on top of what we're doing and what's going on with the show, as well as to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher. So again, you can get the episodes immediately when they come out, and also those ratings and reviews really help us out a lot if you go ahead and do that. And Daniel, thank you once again for joining us today. It's been a while since we had a chance to speak with you, but it's great to have you back on the show, and it's great to talk to you again, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon. Hopefully it'll be sooner than the gap between last time and this time. So thank you so much.
Well, you guys do fantastic work, and thank you so much for having me back on.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast. If you'd like to listen to more episodes, please check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also contact us via our website. And thanks again for listening.